So a very, very warm welcome to this session this afternoon, which is in fact the closing session of what has been 2 extraordinary days in conversation. I want to express very, very warm thanks to our speakers, Francis Nyamnjoh from UCT, Hlonipha Mokoena from here at WISA, Sheila Jasanoff from Harvard, and to thank Sheila at the outset for proposing the title of the session, Imagining, Framing, Disciplining. And we could take these terms in, I think, very fruitful, divergent directions, but also place them in conversation, which is certainly what you would have intended, Sheila, in proposing them. You know, and I think that acts of imagination are, and that we're all feeling this somewhat intensely, are completely crucial to the production of knowledge and to the making of institutions. And it's my hope for this session that we're going to be talking about both, and coming to the question of the university, which is not a question we have come to as yet in our conversations. You know, and secondly, ways of undertaking conceptual work that are reflexive and thoughtful about what falls inside and what outside of our critical ambits in thinking about that notion of framing. As we attempt to understand the world before us. And really that third section on disciplining speaks powerfully, I think, to the limits that we meet or impose perhaps on our capacities to do these first things, to imagine and to frame. You know, and again, the ways in which our institutions and the politics of knowledge and how they play out in specific institutions or enclaves or contexts may constrain the ways in which we're able to think. So I think that it would be good to keep these terms firmly in mind as we move into our session and to return to them at various stages and with various shadings as we go along. Sheila, in your very powerful 2013 piece on epistemic subsidiarity, you discuss what you call the modes of public reason in different contexts, distilling them with enormous clarity into coexistence, which you point out often implies containment, cosmopolitanism, which is constrained by power relations, or not taking power relations seriously enough, and constitutionalism, which is the most demanding, you argue, in its calls for recognition. I was very struck by the closing paragraph in that article, in which you offer these as starting points for reflection, for rethinking the hard task, as you put it, of how to live together in the face of incomplete knowledge, without stamping out diverse ways of knowing and reasoning. So that hard task of how to live together is very much with us, is very intensely with us. We could take it right into the political moment we're occupying right now, as is incomplete knowledge. Possibly in new registers, now a decade on from when you wrote in 2013, in 2023. Decolonization has certainly sharpened calls for enabling different ways of knowing and reasoning. And I think that the South has become a more formidable category, mode of thinking, site of publication and politics as we speak. So the invitation to our speakers is to think about these concepts that are up front for this session, but also to think about their iterations in relation to Southern Africa, the African South, South Africa. And I've asked speakers in putting together the abstract for this session to think South, to help us to think about that. I'd very much like each of you to tell us about your most recent preoccupations in your work right now, your most pressing work, and then to zoom out a little bit, as I know you have prepared to do, in terms of commenting, again perhaps revisiting, what are these modes of imagining, framing, and disciplining that we might think with now in 2023? So I'll ask you to do that in the first instance. And then I invite our speakers to talk to us about the crisis, the question, the potentiality of the university now, if necessary, from your own university now. But also for us to reflect together on the universities of the South. As climate change presents itself, as inequality presents itself again in new modes and more intensive modes, the universities of the South become ever more important, as strengthening them seems crucial. So what is this? How do we approach this question of universities in the South? How do we frame those questions? How do we think about them? And if we could then come to African universities, there are almost 800 universities on this continent. And it seems to me that an incredibly important pedagogical project is to do collective work now towards strengthening African universities. One of the difficult paradoxes of decolonization has meant that many of our best scholars, trained with love and care in this African university and others in South Africa and Southern Africa, are landing up in wealthy institutions in the north. And there are many other paradoxes, I think, to the paradigm that we're trying to think with and work within. I would love to hear from our speakers, how are you seeing the question of the university, the vexed question of the university, in relation to wider ecologies of knowledge that we're working with, that are operating outside of universities? It's always very fascinating to figure out where a university thinks its inside is and where it thinks its outside is. And in the final sequence, if we have time, I ask you to talk to each other more than through me about the question of generational turbulence, generational change. This is a crucial and inevitable part of university life. But it's been occurring to me recently that we might perhaps need to think together about the tools we may need to work with intergenerational conversation in our universities, in relation to rupture, in relation to change, but also in relation to ongoing conversation. So that's how I've hoped that this session will unfold. We're going to ask each speaker to speak for about 10 minutes initially with opening statements, and then the invitation is to take up these questions further. And it does seem that this is a particularly generative conversation to ask our audience, our publics, to speak to us about. So a very, very warm invitation to all of you here. Unfortunately, people online, I think, are not invited to ask questions at this point, but there are enough of you in the room with, I know, a lot to say on these questions to talk to us and to discuss with us these questions. So I'm going to ask Francis to begin, to be followed by Hlonipha and then Sheila. Francis.
Thank you, Sarah. I like the framing that Sheila gave us as a challenge of imagining and framing and disciplining, because I'm the worst person when it comes to discipline. I'm not terribly good with imagination, and my frameworks are all over the place. So I start by asking myself why I accepted to be part of this panel. In that regard, I have been aware of my chronic inadequacies, and I was encouraged by the statement that Sarah made about the last paragraph, the concluding paragraphs about incomplete knowledges. And that is precisely where I would like to position my opening thoughts on the idea of incompleteness as a useful framework for articulating many of the challenges that we are facing, both in the academy and in the wider world. So I use incompleteness as a framework for thinking, articulating, relating to and understanding living togetherness in a world in which to be incomplete is normal and universal. And my idea of incompleteness touches on all aspects of existence, of being and becoming as individuals and as collectivities. It applies to humans and their relationships with non-humans, natural and artificial, animate and inanimate. Its dimensions include relatedness, openness, enrichment, humility, and action. It involves seeking out and kindling connectivities. It is predisposed to and predisposes inextricable embeddedness and entanglement. The concept of incompleteness invites reaching out across real or imagined borders to explore ways of thinking, living socially, bridging and networking to make inclusionary existence more possible, acceptable, recognized, normalized, and institutionalized. Recognizing incompleteness opens the doors for porosity, frontiernness, compositeness, interdependence, active participation, and mutual fulfillment and enrichment. I think that the selfish pursuit of self-interest engenders ordering to center ourselves and jeopardizes the need to balance tensions and checks on conflict. Seeking constructive collaboration between the biological, social, and technological human is supposed to encourage complementarity among competing incompleteness between nature, culture, and technology. Similar complementarity is needed among competing nurtures. Progress is only perfection and complete if inclusive. The unknown, yet to be known, or unknowable make of inclusivity a permanent work in progress. Human achievements is like scientific progress, wherein every hypothesis or basic assumption provides the basis for new inquiries. There are no final answers in life, as the possibility of further discoveries that may upset the present position is never beyond contemplation. Even the universal is always a work in progress. The future is as much in the rearview mirror as it is in the present and ahead. Completeness is a perilous illusion, primarily if defined as independence or autonomy in zero-sum terms. Such delusions are fueled or exacerbated by the tendency to downplay the universality of incompleteness and that humans and their worlds are products of motion and encounters, death and indebtedness. To be born itself means one's origin comes from a source, indicating one's incompleteness and indebtedness. Imagining that one is complete in itself is an illusion because it does not resonate and reconcile with one's ontological constitution as a dependent and incomplete being. No civilization is worth pursuing if founded entirely on borrowing without acknowledging and on the violence of arrogance and ignorance. Put differently, a society without provision for imperfection or incompleteness is delirious, delusional, and narcissistic. Prioritizing essentialisms to the detriment of incompleteness, conviviality, and consciousness is the curse of a world that overly emphasizes regressive, exclusionary logics of claiming and denying belonging through the rigid and opportunistic policing of otherwise porous borders and boundaries. Incompleteness calls on us to admit our fallibility and infinite disposition in all matters. We all need humility to acknowledge that we are ontologically incomplete and need complementarity rather than competition. Humility is the consequence of the awareness of incompleteness and the basis of critical consciousness. It is essential to accentuate the dynamic nature of social action in awareness of incompleteness to temper the feelings of inadequacy, despondency, and the attitudes of passivity that could result from an understanding of being incomplete. The idea of incompleteness generates energy. It invites and compels people to reach out, to move beyond narcissism, hubris, self-pity, or victimhood, to be confident and courageous even in the face of anxious and uncertainty, and to embrace the more comprehensive and fuller world and its complexities, nuance, messiness, and the promise of resiliency and imagination. In other words, incompleteness encourages optimism as an inclusive aspiration for being and becoming as a permanent work in progress. Incompleteness thus entails not only reality but also an awareness of one's imperfections, inadequacies, transience, inexhaustibilities, and infinitude. It enables us to act in particular ways to achieve our ends in a world or universe of myriad interconnections of incomplete beings, humans and non-humans, natural and suprasensory, and amenable and not amenable to perception through our senses and socially cultivated prisms. A disposition of agentive incompleteness would ensure that we do not define and confine unduly. We need to make room for difference and appreciate that not everyone will neatly fit within our sense of what is or what ought to be. If we are always unfinished or unaccomplished, regardless of our achievements or failures, then we are more alert to and accommodating of the humility of doubt. Incompleteness privileges impermanence as a fruitful process of creative renewal in communion with others. Recognizing that one cannot rely entirely on oneself and living without others, things and humans alike, is courageous and humbling. Just as it is humbling and courageous to admit one's delusions of grandeur, or that one cannot apologize for not being perfect anymore. It speaks of the reality of being interdependent, even if we think or are schooled to think otherwise. Our incompleteness often attracts ambiguities because it is inevitably dispersed as composite nature, and a composite nature of one's being means that there is always more or less to something, someone, action, or interaction than our minds, senses, socializations, rational and embodied sensitivities can fathom. Hence, the importance of intersubjectivities and the conversations and orientations it gives rise to as an eternal unfolding of prospects and the possibilities in being and becoming. We are incomplete in every sense of life and need togetherness. Conviviality invites us to celebrate and preserve incompleteness and mitigate delusions of grandeur that come with wanton ambitions and claims of perfection. Conviviality emphasizes the repair rather than the rejection of human creativity and relationships. It is fundamental to being human, biologically, socially, culturally, politically, economically, and technologically. And it is necessary for social renewal, reconstruction, and regenerational processes. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Hlonipha?
Do you want me to just jump straight in?
Yeah.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to speak to all of you. I know it's a Friday afternoon. It's in Johannesburg. The weather's nice. We don't have a beach, but we have a reef, as they say. I would like to begin by offering 3 anecdotes. The first one has to do with studying philosophy at A-levels. So I did my A-levels in the UK, and I studied philosophy, and A-levels are normally 2 years, and we had to do philosophy in 1 year. So an entire A-level in 1 year. And as part of doing our A-level philosophy, we had to read Descartes' Research on Method. So we each get a copy of the book. It's a day like this one, Friday afternoon. I get back to my room, I start reading Descartes, and I get to the part where Descartes tries to prove the existence of God. And I read, I think it's about almost like a page and a half, and it's one whole sentence, basically, an entire page and a half that attempts to prove the existence of God. Friday afternoon, I read it 20 times. I didn't understand. I was like, where is God? Why is God not at my door knocking, going, here I am, you've proven that I exist. Saturday, I spent the whole of Saturday. Now, I've read every other section that we're supposed to read. Still, I do not understand how Descartes reaches the conclusion that God exists. Saturday night. Sunday, we go to chapel, and I'm sitting there in chapel thinking, I cannot figure out how Descartes proves the existence of God. So I go back again and I read the section. Come Monday, I walk into class, and because I'm such a good student, I have to confess to the teacher that I have failed to understand Descartes' proof for the existence of God. So I walk into our philosophy class and I look at our teacher, Mr. Bowden, and I say, Mr. Bowden, I have failed to understand Descartes' proof for the existence of God. And Mr. Bowden looks at me and goes, Hlonipha, you were not supposed to read that section. So I spent the entire weekend trying to figure out what this French philosopher had said about the existence of God, and I wasn't even supposed to read it. So anecdote number one. Anecdote number two is my PhD experience. So my mentor, Professor Andre Dutoy, I was telling him that I was struggling to write and that I had turned to Bach's piano sonatas to try and inspire me to write. So I would I had bought an entire collection of Bach's piano sonatas, and I would put them on and they would play and then I would write. And they worked. And my mentor said, have you listened to Keith Jarrett? I said, Keith Jarrett? He said to me, yes. He said, but I must tell you the story first. I actually accidentally discovered Keith Jarrett because he said he just saw Goldberg variations on the CD cover and took the CD home, not realizing that Keith Jarrett was actually a jazz musician. So most people don't know that he's both. He plays classical music and he's also a jazz musician. So my mentor had thought that Keith Jarrett was a classical musician. So he puts it on, he listens to it, and then somewhere in the middle of listening to the Goldberg variations, he suddenly realizes this is actually not strictly classical music. And then discovers through research that Keith Jarrett is actually also a jazz musician. So that's anecdote number two. The fact that my mentor, who mentored me since my undergraduate, since my honors year, introduced me to Keith Jarrett, and I became a Keith Jarrett fan. I also now sort of listen to Keith Jarrett when I write. Anecdote number three. As part of my work of sort of understanding the history of art, mostly Western art, I try and read as many biographies of Western artists. I was at the bookshop and there is this huge volume of the letters of Vincent van Gogh. So I think, oh, Vincent van Gogh, what could be better than reading the letters of such a great artist? As it turns out, Vincent van Gogh actually intended originally to become a priest. And in fact, this entire collection of letters is his letters to his brother, reciting all his sermons that he had tried to give as a minister. So he was a trainee minister. Okay, so I'm thinking, this is a respected artist. Let me plow through them. 10 pages, 20 pages, I think, hell no. I am not going to spend my time reading these boring, I mean, he would literally rewrite the entire sermon, and that would be the letter to his brother, and he'd be like, and then I turned to Luke 25, verse 3, and I told the congregation, and he would recite the entire sermon. Now, what have these three anecdotes to do with our conversation? Firstly, I don't think it's possible to be imaginative, creative, and cutting edge without the act of being undisciplined. As a child, I forced my family at the age of 4 to teach me to read because I wanted to read everything. So at home, I would point at something and nudge the adult and say, what does it say? And it doesn't matter what it was. they had to tell me whether it's a cereal box or lists of ingredients. And then I also, at some point when I started reading, I discovered an entire box of Charlie Brown cartoons. At that time, I didn't understand that there was such a thing as humor. So I actually sat there and I read Charlie Brown literally. And I sat and I read every single one of the volumes. So I used to sit in my grandfather's tool shed and sweat through Charlie Brown. And I wanted to just read everything. From that moment, at the age of 4, I was an undisciplined and promiscuous reader. My mom was also a librarian, and my mom, being a librarian, never taught me that there were books for adults and books for children. She would just let me loose in a teacher's college library. So I would pick like D.H. Lawrence, and I would read, I think I read Invisible Man when I was like 11 years old. And I would sit at home and plow through Chinua Achebe and all these books that were essentially supposed to be for university students. And I would be reading them at 8, 9, 10, and I have no idea what I thought. Now, what is one of the disadvantages of this? One of the disadvantages of this is I was expelled from kindergarten even before I could get into kindergarten because I demonstrated that I could read. And my grandmother on the way home yelled at me all the way home, like, why did you have to show off? We need somewhere to put you. We can't take you anywhere. So when I was a child, that was my middle name. We can't take you anywhere. Because I would always start reading. And so now what does this have to do with what we're supposed to be talking about this afternoon? I would say that part of the reason why we keep fishing for new vocabularies of knowledge production is that we have deleted from our language useful English words that describe the work of thinking. I am thinking here of a word like autodidact. And if you look at Wikipedia, it says, autodidactism is education without the guidance of masters, such as teachers and professors, or institutions such as schools. Generally, autodidacts are individuals who choose the subject they will study. They are studying material, and they are studying rhythm and time. Autodidacts may or may not have formal education, and their study may be either a complement or an alternative to formal education. Many notable contributions have been made by autodidacts. We're not going to get there, but John Stuart Mill is one of those people, if you're interested. The father of liberalism is a renowned autodidact. The components of the word autodidact should tell you that the human mind is the original machine. The word autos means self, so that means that your brain was meant to learn through a self-directed and a random experimentation with the world. The autodidact is not a person who is anti-institutions. It is a person who goes beyond what is possible within formal institutions. Now, part of what we should be discussing when we're discussing any future rearrangement of the institutions that we currently have is, well, what is the self within an institution? How do we deal with people who exceed the boundaries of the institution? As I say, people who are autodidacts. And as I say, with myself, my grandmother had to basically bribe the school principal to allow me into school at the age of 4.5. So I started attending school at 4.5 because I was getting in everyone's way, essentially, because I kept on asking them to read to me. So then how do you then take someone who is an autodidact, who has already essentially been educated, and then put them in an institution? Part of the problem is this question of what is the self? So again here, I'm going to tell you an anecdote because it's a better way of getting to the question. For those of you who know Ernest Hemingway, he was one of those, in fact, if one had to pick out of the entire body of English literature, he's essentially the typical white male. He was a hunter, he liked killing wild animals, and he also wrote novels. And in his book, A Movable Feast, he gets to the part, literally at the end of the book, where he has to try to explain why he cheated on his wife. And he essentially says this. He says, when I saw my wife again, standing by the tracks as the train came in by the piled logs at the station, I wish I had died before I ever loved anyone but her. I was frustrated when I read that. I thought, Ernest Hemingway, you are one of the greatest writers of the English language, and you can't even explain to us why you cheated on your wife. How is that supposed to be knowledge of the self? Where is the ontology in the fact that you can't even explain to us, Mr. Great White Man, why you cheated on your wife? Now, what actually irritated about the whole thing is that the entire collection, this memoir, is him describing how they went gambling together. So I'm like, this poor woman has a gambling habit. She's now addicted to racehorsing. She's addicted to bullfighting. And then you go and you cheat on her. Explain that to us, please, Mr. Hemingway. So this is, to me, one of the examples. So basically, everything that I have told you is about a simple fact. The artist cannot even explain the artist to themselves. The writer cannot even explain the writer to themselves. Ernest Hemingway couldn't even explain Ernest Hemingway to himself. So how are we, as academics, as intellectuals, supposed to explain ourselves to ourselves? The university is, in some ways, a self-reflective space, but we do not have the language. In the same way that Ernest Hemingway didn't have the language, Vincent van Gogh didn't have the language to describe who he was as an artist. He had originally wanted to be a priest, so he's a kind of accidental artist. So if even the greatest human beings who have ever lived can fail at the job of explaining themselves to themselves, then how are we supposed to be as academics? How are we as intellectuals supposed to explain ourselves to ourselves? And part of what I'm trying to suggest is that perhaps we should go back to words like autodidact, instead of trying to call ourselves other things, and perhaps simply say the university is a place where people who are autodidacts can go and have an office and a place to work. I'll pause there for now. Dilip, behave yourself. I can already see.
Thank you, Hlonipha. Sheila?
But thank you for those two amazing reflections. In a sense, both of them about incompleteness, because whether you're discovering yourself for yourself in a way that you can communicate to others, that is an ongoing process, as your three wonderful anecdotes illustrated to us. And Francis, thanks for that reflection on the sort of completion as a process, as an eternally receding kind of horizon. So I want to bring that discussion back to, Sarah, what you were saying about what it means in this moment for the South to be discovering itself as what? An interlocutor for the North? And in what ways that process has been ongoing for a very long time, and how those of us who are present in this panel and in this room are picking up on the experience of getting to know ourselves and of bringing anything to completion or fruition, have to contribute to that emergence of a distinctively Southern set of perspectives, whatever that term distinctive might mean. So if you want to be anecdotal about it and think about discipline, one of the areas of my own becoming that I hope will resonate is language acquisition. So the mother tongue, the first language of many of us in this room, is not English, and yet the disciplinary language that many of us in this room use is English. And therefore, there has been a disciplining of the imagination, which was initially set free to roam in a different kind of language. And the sort of accidental readings that you were describing, I think that to some extent that matches up against the way that many of us encountered the English language. For myself in India, that too was bookshelves that were in schools and in homes and in friends' homes, and what was on those bookshelves was a bit accidental. So, for instance, I read Sherlock Holmes and Rider Haggard. Rider Haggard, who's not known to many people speaking the English language, though he had a particular fondness for Africa, as it happens. But, you know, this sort of colonial detritus left behind on the bookshelves, and indeed not respecting any particular age. I mean, at what age were you supposed to be reading this? I do remember that I learned the word bereavement by reading Sherlock Holmes, because when he came back from that precipice in Reichenbach Falls, he remembered that Watson had in between lost his wife. I think it was because Conan Doyle didn't actually know what to do about wives, and so this problem about how to write about wives is probably more widespread among white males than just the episode that you described. In any case, Holmes is, politely talking to Watson about how he's sad about his bereavement, and I'm sure that according to the standardized tests that are administered in American schools, this was not a word that I was supposed to have known at that age. So, one's encounter with the language that ultimately becomes the language of discipline, the language in which one speaks, was actually very different from my encounter with my own language, which is Bengali. And I attained a level of proficiency in Bengali, reading and understanding Tagore, that I'm sure was actually much higher than the corresponding, acquaintance with English, or what probably many people achieve even with their first language these days. But I also remember being taught to write English, and my father sitting on the balcony teaching how to write the letter C, and he put a little dot at the beginning where you begin to shape the C, and said, think of this like a coat, and this little dot is the button with which you button up the coat. And that, became for me a kind of reminiscence about the disciplining of the self through the sea of completion, if you will, and how there is a kind of momentary attainment of satisfaction to putting that dot in the right place, that is a kind of punctuated equilibrium, if one can borrow that language from evolution, that is not completeness in the sense of looking on the seventh day of creation and finding that it's all good, but in a sense letting loose a semi-completed thing to see how it's going to have imagination, the capacity to generate into the future. So I think that having also grown up like both of my co-panelists and again others here, not structured within a discipline as such, and yet being forced to think in a way, how do I propagate, how do I teach the things that I know so that other people can build upon them? This dichotomy or this dialectic between completion and non-completion, between being disciplined and not being disciplined, between autodidacticism, if you will, and yet being a pedagogue, which requires you to transmit that ineffable thing that you learned to other people, that has been one of the sort of consuming challenges of my life as I've been involved in trying to think, what does my evolving field, science and technology studies, really mean? I mean, what does it mean to do a field that has not had a place in schools, in universities, and in what ways does the university provide a sort of creative ground in which thinking about this field can happen in a disciplined and yet never completed way? So we're all familiar with the fact that if there's a rich discipline, it is not ossified. It has ways of reinventing itself. You can have a field like history, which has, what does it have? It says my subject matter is thinking about change through time. And that's almost the only axiomatic thing there. But in what voice you look, even with what you look, these are things that have been up for contestation. So within history, one of the richest veins of thinking has been about the status of the archive. At one time, it was taken for granted that if you did history, you had to go to this repository called the archive. But in that sense, people were not thinking about how my bookshelves of Conan Doyle and Rider Haggard and whatever else I found there was itself a funny archive. I mean, what were these books? I mean, they were like going to an inn in New England and finding that the read books that people chose to leave behind were the the detritus of the old civilization receding from this other civilization, and then you picked it up in this sort of herd, half-herd, to quote T.S. Eliot, a voice from somewhere and yet nowhere. So in that context, knowing that disciplines themselves are to some extent emergent, self-reinventive, constantly going over and reflecting on what it is that gives them an identity, a reason to call themselves even a discipline, and then being in the position of having to invent something else that doesn't exist. I felt that while it's a challenge, it is a challenge for creativity in a sense, that one has to understand discipline in a way that is not constraining. And while I appreciate that Van Gogh didn't really know what he was becoming, after all, he never sold one of his paintings in his life, and even Theo Van Gogh, the brother, who made himself the custodian of Van Gogh's work, didn't manage to sell any of his brother's paintings. He gave him other things, love, devotion, understanding, for this extremely troubled mind. But in those letters, there is an art criticism that is quite amazingly developed, because when Van Gogh met paint, he did understand what that stuff was about. And embedded in his other writings to Theo are reflections on the way he painted, so much so that in one of his letters he talks about how he has made sunflowers his own. And we know you can go to an exhibition. I mean, recently there was an exhibition on Van Gogh and his cypress paintings. That is the tree, not the island, cypress trees. But you could similarly go to a place where you see only Van Gogh sunflower paintings and flower paintings, and then you think, well, this man did articulate what he was all about, and he did it, however, to his brother, a person who understood him holistically and completely, in a sense. And it's in those sorts of moments that I think the dialectical paradoxes of autodidacticism, non-completeness, the fragmentariness of experience, and yet the urge to teach and discipline come into play and become real for all of us.
Thank you, Sheila. I'd like to take it back to Francis to comment on the terrain we've covered since you began, and Hlonipha and Sheila have spoken.
Yeah, I think I see the resonances with that knowledge production, being in a university, requires a navigation of these the tensions between aspiration to be schooled and to reproduce a set of values that you can see it constitutes a tradition, but at the same time not to glorify or to ingrain or enshrine those in ways that are so rigidly done as to obfuscate the very idea of knowledge production as a continuous open-ended quest. And I do think in that sense, what we are trying to, what comes through for me here is to put it in, I know the word Ubuntu in certain circles has lost its currency, but I still think that if one's incompleteness can only be mitigated through an effort to extend yourself, to mobilize yourselves, to use technologies of self-extension, be these technologies machine or relationships with others, if that is what mitigates the challenge of incompleteness in a universe where incompleteness is permanent, then it is important for us to see it in Ubuntu terms, like we temper our incompleteness through the capacity to be mobile and to mobilize ourselves with all various extensions in order to achieve, but every achievement in many ways is an opening up for new challenges. And that's the joy of listening to the challenges of being human in this case, and being human in a particular context with particular demands on you, be this a university or be this the global south, but always knowing that one is not acting in splendid isolation, but always a creative generation. And that's where, right from the first day, we had this sense, the keynote and the comments that we got was the sense of the importance of motion, the importance of technologies like what extends us, takes us to another level to be able to mitigate the challenges of incompleteness. And that when we are mobilized, we encounter what is unfamiliar. Be this a sense of disciplinary mobilizations. When you circulate as a discipline, through ideas, through conferences, coming from Harvard and Norway and around South Africa, meeting here at WISER, the encounters are generative. And the encounters then lead to a sense of who you are that is not the same as which came through. And hence the notion of, I think it was Ashil that mentioned it earlier in the presentation of these compositions and recomposition, a compositeness of being, that we become composites. And if we think of reimagining our knowledge production and our place in it in a way that provides for that compositeness, then you are not disciplined to the point of discipline becomes productive in the sense that you use that discipline to forage for creative innovation. And once you encounter it, you take it in as a way of taking the inside out. So it's constantly that generative encounter. And for me, I find that in many ways is what comes through from the start of our conversation.
Thank you. Hlonipha, would you like to comment?
I think Sheila has used a word that I also like very much, detritus, because you've put it so beautifully that I think I'm just going to echo what you said and echo it back to the audience, because I agree with you. In fact, I go even further and say that we come to university to talk to dead people. So the university is a kind of entombment of dead civilization, dead ideas, dead people. And it's one of the reasons why we often find it so difficult to explain to other people what we are doing, because we are essentially a kind of priesthood that is dedicated to the veneration of the dead. And it is this detritus of Western civilization, but also other civilizations, and also very random. So I'll give you an example. For example, the Johannesburg Art Gallery, I don't know how many of you have been there, but the Johannesburg Art Gallery is a custodian of these, the funerary objects from China. There's like a whole garden that is dedicated, that was dedicated to a lot from these funerary statues from China. And it's sort of, well, how did they travel from China all the way to Johannesburg? And so it's also about this randomness of what actually we are collecting as this detritus of our civilization. And it sounds like it's a negative thing to say we are dedicated to having a conversation with dead people, or we are dedicated to the preservation of civilizational detritus. But actually, it's not a negative thing. There is a certain honor, quote unquote, if one can use that old-fashioned word, in being able to speak to the dead, in being able to converse with people who perhaps were here perhaps thought that it was a good idea to tell us what they thought while they were here. It does not mean we have to hold them up as examples of what we should be doing, but it still does make some kind of sense for us to think of ourselves as actually collectors of civilizational detritus, but also of being honest about it. Because I think what is at stake here in the way that we are framing the question are the questions that the audience often, or the public often wants to know about what we do. And again, here I'm going to tell you some anecdotes one anecdote. I was sitting at a restaurant and the waiter says to me, "Oh, you're a professor." I say, "Yes, I'm a professor." And they say, "Oh, there's this book that we've been reading in church. I would like your opinion on it." So I'm like, okay, church books, okay, this is already a little shaky. So he says to me, "Oh, I'll wait for you to finish eating." I say, no. I say, in my head, I'm thinking, it's going to cause indigestion if I find out later. It's better if I find out now so that the indigestion can happen now. So I say, no, fetch the book and I'll look at it. He goes to the locker room, he comes back, and guess what the book was? The Da Vinci Code. And I'm like, the Da Vinci Code? And he's like, "Yes, we're discussing it in church about whether it's true about who were the Machiavelli, the Medici family." And I'm thinking, should I tell him about the prince? Should I say, "Read Machiavelli and you will find a better version of the Medici family"? Or should I just let it go? So anyway, I mean, this is what people often think. They think that as university professors, we are essentially dealing with conspiracy theories. And I'm like, no, that's not my department. That's not my department. I think that's the psychology. You know, you feel like you need to pass the ball to somebody else. But here is a person who really wants to know, as a professor, what I think about the Da Vinci Code. What do I say? What do I say that is productive? What do I say that is not dismissive? What do I say also that is not so academic that the person almost thinks, "Oh, what a waste of time. Why did I bother speaking to a professor?" So I think sometimes really the issue is our public image that we are having a problem with. As academics, when we are together, we do not have a problem with each other. We understand each other more or less. But it's when we face the public that we suddenly have these anxiety attacks. What should we tell them? It's almost like that is the conspiracy that the public wants to know about, is the fact that we are sitting here saying, but what should we tell them about ourselves? What story must we fabricate about what we are doing in the academy? What narrative must we give to the public? And it is that anxiety, in fact, that I think is the negative part. Because we end up actually almost telling the public a lie. We tell the public that we are doing something that is socially useful. Not really. We tell the public that we are educating the next generation. Well, as one of my favorite band used to say, there are a lot of people who come out of universities and they are just educated fools. And I mean, all of you know what was that rapper's name now? We spend all our lives living in the gangster's paradise. Money and the power, power and the money, minute after minute, after hour, hour after hour, right? And there's a line there about educated fools. I'm an educated fool with money on my mind. So a lot of educated fools are out there with bachelor's degrees, PhD degrees. So, I mean, are we really going to take responsibility for all the educated fools who come out of our universities? Not really. We tell the public that we are here working in the public interest. But many of the things that we do actually in the university would destabilize the public interest if people truly understood what we were working on. I'm going to pause there just so that we can have the opportunity to expand the conversation.
Hlonipha, thank you for being as provocative as we've come to expect. Sheila?
For me, the bigger challenge is not how to talk to the public at large, but what to teach students. And to some degree, what you said provides a jumping off point. So some of the people who've done the most to transform the world recently are uneducated fools. Two very prominent ones are dropouts from Harvard University, Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates before him. And between Microsoft and Facebook, I think they have transformed the way that we know the world more than most other people who have done that through, for instance, works of literature. So what did they learn? I once met a Silicon Valley person who spoke disparagingly of a CEO in Silicon Valley and said that most CEOs have either experience or education, and this person has neither, and so therefore beware the CEO. So we have uneducated fools who are transforming the world. And I think we can teach our students to become citizens of the world in which the uneducated fools are exercising that kind of creative capability and imagination that governs us. So how to make people better readers of their own circumstances. And this is where I think the voice of the South matters, because the North is used to reading itself, but the North is not as used to being read by the South. And for a long time, authority lay in the fact that the North was reading the South and telling the South how to understand itself. My friend Shiv Vishwanathan once said in a flight of rhetoric that we have to teach the North, not that your history is not our future. But embedded in that small statement was an observation about the way the North, at least its Protestant Christian dimension, reads itself, because there's a linearity there, a sense that goes through, for instance, the creation myth that one day follows the next and it builds one upon the other, and the whole idea of progress to a pinnacle that is represented by the human, and that we were doing something to destabilize in one of yesterday's conversations, but also the subject-object distinction that people talked about in universities. I mean, there are certain ways of knowing and understanding the world that become more apparent through the transversal reading that the South can bring in its gaze on the North. So if I'm thinking about objectification and the biological sciences and life sciences, on which I do a lot of work from an STS perspective, but in the back of my mind is the Tattvam Asi story, which is well known to people, which is also a story about somebody teaching biology to a student, right? I mean, the person asks, where the student says, where am I in this being? And the fruit is opened up and the seed is shown, and, you are that. I mean, that is a holistic, a non-experimental, but a different kind of demonstration of what being is, what ontology is, which has had actually quite resonant power in the West when philosophers have picked up that story. So I think reclaiming a way to tell the stories about somebody else's inevitability in ways that bring out the incompleteness of those perspectives and those stories, demonstrates where the hubris of self-knowledge has to give way to the humility of partial knowledge. These are things that I think one can claim, but one can claim it more powerfully, I think, by doing two kinds of things. One is by being comparative, and in my own work, I've done a lot of north-north or west-west comparisons. This is not undertaken by most scholars from the South, but it destabilizes this monolithic quality of the North and reveals other tendencies within it. And the other is something that many of you are doing anyway, which is being unembarrassed about recovering one's own historical continuity as a way of reading other people's claims to a sort of superior sense of continuity. I mean, why is it that even the word encounter, I mean, in anthropology, first encounter is a term, but who encounters whom? I mean, the first encounter is always the explorer, the anthropologist from some other country that comes and lands upon the culture that, I mean, but, the Cook story is told in multiple different ways now because of its iconic quality, and certainly has been told from the standpoint of those who encountered Cook and not only how Cook encountered them. But I think many of those kinds of reversals of perspective that are only now beginning to take place, carried further in all disciplines. So I think subaltern history, for instance, is one such move in history. But I think that a lot of disciplines, including literature and art history, could begin to take on board some of that turning of the gaze back around from being the observed to becoming the observer, and being more, confident about one's own positionality and turning that gaze back on those who did the gazing.
Yeah.
And I think that is a more powerful way of decolonizing than simply complaining eternally about having had one's own gaze submerged for too long. And make it active, make it productive.
Yeah.
Quick one.
Quick one.
Yeah.
Okay.
I think that's very important. And one way of doing that is to ensure that along with the universality of incompleteness is the universality of motion. Because often when we talk about motion, it seems as if that is the mobility of the anthropologists, the mobility of others. Those powerful and privileged are the ones who move and then they define. And the tendency of such mobilities with ambitions of conquest is to define and confine. Whereas if you have mobility as a universal, then the people you encounter and on whom you project a gaze should not be treated as if they are in a permanent state of immobility or some sort. The challenge for us studying such processes is to question what forms of mobility alternative to the ones that currently defining the disciplines, for us to begin to have a much more complex and nuanced idea of what is actually going on.
I think we'd like to put plenty on the table. We'd like to invite now people to ask questions, make a comment, free associate in terms of what you've heard, and to address that to all our speakers or one of our speakers. So the floor is open. Yeah.
I also would like to just add a little bit about this, because one of the moment of, I guess, becoming for me where I knew what I wanted to do was exactly the moment when I realized that I no longer had to try to be a philosopher, because that was my original interest when I went to university. But that in fact the question I should be asking myself is, what are the philosophies from this place where I am? And that's how I discovered the writer that I did my PhD on. As an isiZulu writer that everyone had essentially forgotten, and yet he wrote one of the most influential books of the early 20th century. He wrote a book that attempted to write a history of black people on the African continent. And he was writing it with no institutional safety. He didn't have a position at a university. He was publishing these histories in newspapers, and people were reading them in isiZulu. And so for me, that was the moment at which the whole anxiety about Descartes and the existence of God and ontology, and I was, no, I'm leaving all of that behind, all of those anxieties. I'm going to pursue this idea of an intellectual tradition that is based here and that is outside of the institutions. And I think that is one of the issues that in South Africa we often don't want to deal with, that in fact some of the best intellectual work that has ever been produced by this country has happened outside of universities. We want to pretend that the universities have always been in the vanguard, whereas in fact the universities in the case of South Africa have been 20 steps ahead of many of these tin trunk intellectuals who really forced their way into a public sphere through very, very basic media like the newspaper, letter writing, people writing sort of like weekly columns in newspapers just on invitation. They were not being paid. Their only satisfaction was essentially having an audience to have debates with. And I think that's a very different way of thinking about what an intellectual culture actually looks like.
Both then and now.
Yes,
Yeah,
who would
yeah.
we be if we didn't have the institutional backing, if we didn't have the protection of universities?
Yes, thank you. Yes, Dilip, and then Sheila. Yes.
I didn't see a button, you just had to press the bottom. So there we go with all this education that we are talking about. This is a fascinating panel brought together in a usual magisterial fashion by Professor Jasanoff. I just want to pick up on two things in the form of a comment. One was when you brought up the request by the waiter for you to explain Da Vinci Code to him and to his congregation. And then I was thinking about your comment on the university as a séance, where we bring dead people to life and so on. And then I was thinking of the artist David Shrigley, who recently pulped 6,000 copies of the Da Vinci Code and printed them as 1984 by George Orwell. And I think this is what the university does. It changes conspiracy theory into a pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. So there is a kind of circulation there. And the other thing that I was thinking about when you mentioned the word autodidact, which resonates with a lot of us who enter the university with another language, right? And our universities are largely monolingual universities in a multilingual landscape. We are taught to abandon what we bring to the university in order to learn what the university has to teach us. We lose our voice. And then we spend our lifetime trying to acquire a voice. Because the university is not about teaching you to acquire that voice. It is to teach you to conform. And for those of us in the South who are in many senses subordinate to the political economy of publishing, very often to publish, you need to conform, you discipline yourself. You can't have a voice because the voice that you project from here does not resonate with an understanding and imagination out there. And that's where I again thought of your example of Keith Jarrett. See, one of the things about Keith Jarrett playing the Goldberg variations and Glenn Gould playing the Goldberg variations is that they bring their voice to it, literally. You can hear Glenn Gould humming, and in every recording of Keith Jarrett, he hums along with as he's playing, and he brings his voice to what is a classical recording and disrupts it, right? And so these are just thoughts that went through my head as you spoke, and I think these are all, this question of does the university help you find a voice? What is the fate of the autodidact within the university are, I think, very resonant questions.
Thank you. Sheila, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, thank you so much. I think like Dilip, I'm still kind of mulling and thinking. I mean, I guess I have a small question, a small, quite like basic question for Sheila, but just thinking in terms of how you framed the panel, Sarah, and then what Sheila said about, the global South. You called it a formidable category as a modality of, discovering itself. And also what you said at the end, Sheila, about how to move from, I guess, a position of critique, I think you said complaining, to, a reversal of who is the observer, observed, etc. And finally, thinking of Hlonipha's example at the end about intellectual traditions, I just actually wanted to ask you what you think about decolonizing in this moment, where, at least for us, or the way I see it, decolonizing often in the realm of higher education here very easily becomes about Africanization. And what we often struggle with is comparative perspectives. Like I myself have been trying to think very seriously about how to make the South talk to the South, rather than constantly talk back to the North, because obviously I work on India, now I'm in South Africa, so that's, I mean, it's also interesting how that's come easily to me, and and it's not easy at all, actually. So I'd just be curious to know what you think, and I suppose how you think one can make that move from critique to something more transformative, world-making, etc. Thank you.
Thanks. We could take one more. Yeah, go ahead.
Hi, thank you so much, and hello, colleague in the corner there, Francis. We're from the same department. Hi. I think that both Dilip and my colleague, who I don't know yet, have made such important interventions. I think one of our biggest issues in the Global South is that we are unable very often to speak in journals, where peer reviewers require over and over and again the comments to speak to their conversations, which are not my conversations, not the conversations our students or our country are having. So there's the issue of journal publication. That it's been easier for me to write books and publish as chapters in books than to publish in journals. But I think one of the big issues is that I think for a large part of the time, we social scientists are talking to ourselves. And there's the most extraordinary set of interventions going on globally at the moment that implement neoliberalism into our future and into our children's futures and several generations ahead in ways that are frightening. And I think so often we're paying more attention to what the professional associations internationally are setting as agendas than we are to the very real interventions that are going on in regards to carbon trading and to the kinds of issues that Sheila raises in so many of her papers. So just try and sum up my intervention, it really seems to me that we should be building very, very strong movement towards science studies in South Africa. We have very, very little science studies. We have very little engagement with these issues and processes. I mean, I'm delighted that Francis and others are starting to engage AI, and that's crucial. I think we really need more and more and more of that. So, WISER started also with science studies, but it's astonishing to me that South African universities simply don't have departments of science studies. So I think Global South conversations with the bureaucratic science that Sheila so beautifully describes is a really key direction we need to be going in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Sheila, would you like to start?
Thank you. Let me begin with Sheila's question because it's kind of foundational about definitional things. But yesterday we were talking about how I might define constitutions and constitutionalism, and I was saying that part of the richness of that word as a framing device lies in its multiplicity of meanings, and that one shouldn't sacrifice any of those meanings necessarily, because sometimes one might want to use the word as a noun and refer to an object, but other times one might want to use it as a verb and talking about different ways of making order and writing the fundamental principles of whatever it is that one is ordering. And in that sense, I think decolonization is one of those powerful buzzwords that we in universities are good at generating, just like advertising agencies, really. But then just as a good advertising agency takes the buzzword and decides, which model of male brawn or female beauty to attach it to, so also I think we can take our intellectual buzzwords and decide what our particular project is. And for some people, decolonization might mean bringing to life some dead voices that have been forgotten and without justification, and for other people it might mean reversing the gaze to take on different kinds of perspectives on older problems that have not been looked at in those ways. I think it's a kind of emancipation. It's to ask questions that were not the questions of the conqueror or of the observer or of whoever one puts in the hegemonic position. But that could also be one's guru. I mean, that is, one can be a disciplinary rebel and start asking questions inside of one's discipline that are not the ones that were asked before, in some sense. And I think that that brings me to one resonant part of what Dilip was saying about coming into universities without a language. I guess I would slightly take issue with that and say that we come into universities with lots of languages, like we do into... Yeah, okay, but so disciplines have a way of curing you of your inherited language and teaching you something else. So as you know, I'm trained in law, and legal education operates like a boot camp. It doesn't force you to slog through underbrush and sometimes be hazed to death, although it, I think, does that kind of brutalizing to your imagination of justice. In some sense, it disciplines the imagination of justice to only those arguments about justice that can be done through law, which is a kind of impoverishing of the imagination. But similarly, if you look at a discipline like economics that presumes to understand value, how societies value things, it imposes an extremely constraining language on something that is absolutely foundational to the way people think. So I think the role of critical theory and of the humanities in particular in this time when the humanities are so under attack is to go into those moments where discipline and capacities inside of established fields are actually constraining the imagination so that the knowledge that we have as lay people, as communities, as... I really don't so much like the term indigenous because it's used in an asymmetrical way. I mean, I think we're all indigenes in different cultural settings, but how the indigenes construct their own fables and forms of life and how to open them up to other gazes is, I think, an important lesson to teach and be learned. And I think that brings me to Leslie's point about science studies. I mean, of course, I just want to say right on and stop right there because, as you know, I've spent a good part of my life, advocating for more science studies. But I'm at a stage in my life where I also believe deeply, be careful what you wish for. Because whose science studies, and indeed science and technology studies, whose version of STS, and will the STS that is being disciplined and taught be the STS of my imagination, a field that retains fertility, retains plasticity, retains a sense of its own incompleteness and always already sense of coming into being, vis-a-vis the two disciplines that claim to bring closure into the world most definitively. This is a fact. Science tells you so. This is an artifact. We built it and it works. Look, planes fly. They do not fall out of the sky. Yet there is a Canadian sci-fi writer who actually begins an entire series of works by having the plane suddenly drop from the sky through some cosmic thing that happens. So, the imagination of the science studies critic who actually wants to stop the plane in its tracks by showing that it didn't have to be, not that planes can't fly, that's ridiculous, that's not the project of STS, but, that kind of live, politically vibrant STS. I built a department where that is no longer the ethos. So it's not building departments, it's building the critical faculty and making it swim in people's blood. That's so not making the dead speak, but making living people speak about why one should bother remembering the dead, including stylized artifacts.
Francis, would you like to come in?
Perhaps just to add that there used to be a time when we celebrated the idea that the dominant or disciplining language did not carry the day because we could adopt and adapt. We were creative in how we adopted English. Someone like Chinua Achebe would say he turned the English language into a medium that he could use to tell his Igbo stories. And he did it very well. He adapted the language. And in Francophone Africa, we have the idea that when you hear popular French spoken, somebody from the French Academy would have to go back to school to understand what is being said. So creative adoption of the language. But journals and publishing is all about standardization, predictable forms of using language that is flattening. And it seems if we are complaining, and rightly so, about journals, we should brace ourselves to complain even more with generative AI, whereabout you cannot write a sentence now increasingly without Microsoft interfering or Google telling you how to, the spelling of a word and the sentence structure and so on and so forth. So there's this standardization and flattening of every language possible. Creativity is not allowed. We are completely taken prisoners in terms of linguistic our linguistic capacity, which is, if we're talking about the need for decolonization, we should build get our tools ready to fight an even stronger fight for the future dominated by generative AI. Yeah,
Thank you.
In addition, in some ways, to trying to create space for the multiplicity of languages that we speak, I also think that the English language itself is in danger. So I've started my own little project where when people post these very bizarre sort of gurus, I call them gurus of the internet expressions, I screen grab them. So I'll give you one of the most hilarious one over the last couple of weeks. Lupita Nyong'o had her heart broken. The actress had her heart broken by her boyfriend, who happens to have a connection with South Africa because his father is a famous jazz musician, Hugh Masekela. So someone posted on social media, Selima Masekela has turned Lupita Nyong'o into a motivational speaker. And it's because Lupita Nyong'o had posted some image saying, I have entered the season of heartbreak, something like that. Now, this concept of a motivational speaker is actually what I think in the English language has taken over. We are now all supposed to speak like motivational speakers, say these very bizarre, like the other day, one said, the comfort zone that you are sitting in may not be the best place to be, or something like that. So I'm thinking to myself, this is like the oracle, but like the most bizarre oracle of a kind of civilization in which every day I sort of have to have a problem, and some guru somewhere on the internet is supposed to solve my problem by giving me something to be, I don't know how many of you use this Daily Calm. So there's this app called Daily Calm, and every day it gives you little aphorisms to make you a happy person. So when I read those, I think the English language is now in danger of being turned into this bizarre sort of language of motivational speakers, because that seems to be the only function that is left for the English language. And so for me, the irony is that it is us, the people in the South, who are actually going to end up rescuing the English language from its own derangements. Every time I read, and also people misspell things. So I'm sitting there as well going, no, not Heavenly Father. So just this morning, I read Dear Heavenly Father, and I said, no, it's heavenly. So I'm standing there with the phone going, not Heavenly Father, heavenly. So imagine me now rescuing the English language from its own kind of derangement into motivational speech. So I think that is the other challenge as well. It seems that in the South, we are also in some ways now so invested in the English language that we are the ones who are essentially going to, in some ways, we are now holding two balls. On the one side, this question of these local intellectual traditions, and then the other question is what is English to us? You know, why have we invested so much in the English language that in some ways we are now the custodians of the English language? Because as I say, when I read these motivational claptrap that I have, and I literally, I mean, they serve their function. I sort of feel relieved that I don't have to think about my problems for that day, because daily calm has given me a solution for my problems for the day. But it's also kind of, it's anxiety inducing, the idea that every day you must have a problem which the oracle of the internet has to solve for you.
I have the feeling that in the spirit of holding the extraordinary texture of this conversation, we should now just take one final round of questions and comments and then close it. So could we do that? Perhaps just 3 more.
Thank you so much for that very provoking session. Thank you so much, particularly Professor Jasanoff. I think it's been 3 days of just, and the way you've held it, it's just like switching in between these things. It's just been, I thought, and we were talking with Professor Menon earlier, and I said, you know, when I become old, I want to be like that too, like just. I want to grow like that, and so I just want to go back to what you said about the disciplining of English as disciplining imagination. I mean, I can't even dream in Zulu anymore. I mean, I dream in English. That's how it is, which means it's deep. I think it's gone really, really in. You can't even think in any other. But the question that I want to come in, particularly on marrying the autodidact and the pedagogue, particularly from scholars writing from the South. I mean, we're writing from the global South, trying to imagine the world from this perspective and trying to do, I think other scholars have called, they've tried to think it as how Euro-America is evolving towards the South. And so we're trying to do that kind of inversion, you know. But at the same time, we have to find theories that are from the North, you know. I mean, all I want to say is tell that person in Harvard or Oxford that, man, you're talking nonsense. You don't know what you're talking about. You've never been to Africa. You've probably been to one country, but suddenly you've become an authority in Africa. But I have to find a theory to talk to that person, you know. And that theory comes from the North, you know, because the South doesn't develop theories. Theories are developed in the North, and they get tested this side. And so what kind of thinking, what kind of approach can we engage this as new writers and researchers in this space? Because knowledge in the South has always been a fight between the autodidact and the pedagogue. Knowledge, I think I've learned more from the street, from the man in construction and security than I have in the room, you know, in the academy. All I've learned here mostly is English and the discipline itself, the academic talking. So knowledge in the South gets created in that kind of like struggle of life and thinking. So I just want to hear your engagement on that, on how do we engage the marrying of the two in responding to this invasion of thinking the world from the South?
Thank you. Yeah.
Is it okay? Yeah. Oh, thanks very much for that opportunity. I just want to reflect just broadly, because I think I've learned a lot in this forum. My name is Alfred. I'm Shabalala. I'm from one of the guys just here around town. I'm a practicing attorney in Johannesburg. My interest with the university is because basically I'm from the raw township life where I come from. And my understanding of our communities, the way they live, the way where South Africa is today, when I'm also looking how much can we be able to take from the experiences that people are going through into this intellectual world, because I see things are refined here, things are working very well, and if anything, historically for the future generations were to happen, even just at the level of the knowledge of how democracy has brought things like constitution. I was listening even yesterday, I couldn't contribute because there were issues just take me in and out of this room. But I was listening broadly and I was saying, God, here is the situation, here is the place where these things must be able to interact. Because I think we are losing a process whereby we are able to take this conversation from the ground, from where things are happening, and from where the real experience comes in. And as a lawyer, I see that the reason why we are also facing challenges in terms of crime and all those things is because these conversations are not going on at a greater level where people are. And this, so that they can think, because I was thinking that the university also does that. It actually promotes a culture of learning, exchange, and information sharing. It tries to account of what is taking place in the society. Well, they may well do that, but if there's no feedback, if they cannot get some form of a feedback, it's impossible for them to know about it. The same with the communities, if they cannot be able to interact with this higher level, is impossible to get to it. But yet, when I was listening to my professor, Hlonipha, I could sense that something can happen, because the way she relates, the way she brings experiences, particularly from when she was a child, the way she related with the issues of English, of education, sorry for saying English. And I'm thinking of many people who could be also in some of their way be custodians of some form of intellectualism, which is not recognized because they are not very close to these researches that have been going on, and they have not been discovered. Because we have learned through history that even what is happening in this side of the world, Africa, whatever we have was discovered by the time when somebody arrived. So at all times when things were happening there before the arrival, there was no discovery, and therefore our information could not have been captured, and it could not have been used to some form of levels. So I'm very impressed with what is going on here. Just that I wanted to say that I think it could also be as important for it to touch the ground more than we are doing it, because I think the ground is missing this sense of accountability. And the ground don't think is too much of people who don't know anything. The ground today is about how the world has become. Our politics has become, our parliament has been able to account. So the ground is actually what takes us through, and is what makes us to be what we are. The governance, those areas that we have touched, most of them. So I think we should be able to have a way in which we are interacting to a level whereby all these people who are playing important roles and those who are playing unimportant roles are able to see a way forward, because I'm sure we must account. We are living in a particular period that must also account, as we are able to read history today, to say these things are happening.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
You.
Thank you. Fatima's last question.
I hope you can hear me. Yeah. I guess my question is more of just a summary for Sheila. You've been here these past, 3 days, and there's been some really inspiring interjections that you've made. And I think that the question on my mind is just, as you leave, the space of Wiser, space of Johannesburg, is there something that you've taken away from here that perhaps you didn't know before you came? Or is there something that, has now, being in the space, something that's inspired you to perhaps look into? So, yeah.
Thank you. Sheila, would you like to start?
Well, maybe I should conclude with the last question and begin earlier on with the theory point, and to some degree the questions about democratization of knowledge, which I think is embedded in this point you were making about how the theory comes from the North. So, I think maybe I didn't articulate this very well. I think that emancipation is in making the kind of move that you're suggesting, that is, make it plain and one's own right to question the ways in which theory, comes to occupy such a dominant position in the first place. So a theory is, after all, what? An abstraction from experience, from the ways in which people are actually living. And because of the partiality of knowledge, which was a theme from the very beginning, it's bound to be an incorrect model in some senses. And so when your person, you, for instance, might meet this putative authority about Africa who's never actually visited Africa or has visited one country and yet presumes on the basis of theory to say whatever, I think that the critical move and the justified move is to call out the partiality of that theory as being not equal to the task. And why is it in any case that a particular form of learning, which is to extract theory from the richness of experience, should be entitled to more respect than the experience itself? That is, to some degree, a point that has, I think, been threading through many of the contributions over the 2.5 days or 3 days that we've had. And I think that there are corollary questions. If we agree that it's human experience we should be talking about, and not theories of human experience lodged in the oracular powers of dead people whom we bring to life, in a moment, but rather that we're talking about human beings, human societies, living problematic lives with things happening to them, and we're wanting to know how is it that one expresses a voice of the good or of a common will, and what is democracy when the demos only has to speak through the inadequate filter of university-based, expert knowledge. If those are the kinds of questions that we're dealing with, I think that one has a very powerful basis for raising those kinds of questions from the so-called global South. But it's, in a sense, the South that possibly has been more free because it has not been captive to this rather false idea that there are 2,500 years of continuous theorizing to which we now owe a particular debt of gratitude because this is where life really is. So what are the kinds of questions? In my own work, which includes environmental stuff, for instance, I am quite interested in the fact that it took 30 years for a pamphlet that was written in around 1991 called Global Warming in an Unequal World for the scientists and experts in climate change of the global North to wake up and say, hey, loss and damage is a thing. Whereas if you had adopted climate justice instead of climate change as your framing device from the beginning, then loss and damage would have been right on the table from the start. So where are for STS, the question becomes, What is it that is the barrier to knowledge? And I think that one thing science studies can do as a field is be more articulate about where those barriers set in. And I'll only mention one because we don't have time. But one is that the fact that when you innovate a way of thinking, which your critic from the Global South may be doing when contesting an established theory, you sort of have to teach the person on the listening end how to listen. So my late colleague Trevor Pinch, with a co-author, wrote about the Moog synthesizer. And the fact, not just that this was an instrument and it makes certain kinds of noises and you can talk about the physics of how those noises are made, but that for the synthesizer to come into being so that you could hear the Goldberg variations in a different musical idiom, you needed to develop a listening capability. And Ludwig Fleck, who is celebrated as one of the first contributors to the sociology of knowledge making, talks about new scientific theories as being like learning a new language or a new musical harmony, that you actually have to create a thought collective that thinks and listens and hears in that other language. And I think that is a work of patience, but if we recognize that that is what needs to go on, to some extent we can cultivate in the so-called Global South, our own understanding of audiences and reception, and pay more attention to the ways in which dominant theories have colonized the minds of listeners so that they think there are no other theories, and how to, liberate the experiential dimension so that people are prepared to hear that there are critiques. I think that is a serious intellectual challenge, and one I hope many people will be engaged in. So, coming back to WISA, I find it far more satisfying to be almost anywhere talking to people than in my economics-dominated surroundings in the Kennedy School of Government. So it's not, what is inspirational, but just, feeling at liberty to talk to people who I think get what I'm saying, without my having to do a constant work of translation. But being in South Africa, which after all, also like India, occupies a very special place. It is not here and not there. It is not south and not north. It is a tapestry of cultures. It is a place where coexistence, one of the words that Sarah mentioned that I think about, and cosmopolitanism have been thought through in profoundly constitutionalist terms, including the creation of constitutional language that is not present in the constitutions of other countries, and therefore offers a hook for reimagining the common good in ways that are not available, for instance, under the American Constitution, which is more than a couple of hundreds older. So those kinds of things, a sort of enlivening of the imagination through thinking about how other people are living together and solving those sorts of problems, is in itself a revivifying kind of experience, because you meet it on the ground. And when you do something, as we were fortunate to do, like go to the Apartheid Museum, that is telling the story in the local vernacular and not just something that we watched on television or through the Divest Harvard movement around South Africa during apartheid, it has a different sort of meaning and liberates one's thinking with other stories, other ways of narrating things. So yes, there is a great deal that I will take away and that will necessarily animate my own thinking from different stories or examples that I might tell to my students, to just reimagining the fundamental terms of my own analytic vocabulary, such as constitutionalism. And this is an incomplete process, and I'll be engaged in it for a long time to come.
Thank you. Francis, would you like to make a closing comment?
Yeah, just to add that the good thing with the mobility of incompleteness is that it stands to enrich itself through encounters with others that may question it or may point it to other ways of seeing and doing. And I think in that sense, if we consider the dominant theories from the West as mobile through the Global South in various ways, the challenge is for those theories to understand the result of the encounters through implementation in our research, and to acknowledge that those encounters help to redefine them, to shape them, to extend them. And the challenge is for us to point to knowledge producers who pontificate from the North that they do not always acknowledge their debts and indebtedness to other areas of inquiry. And the more we can do that, not by throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but by stretching the theories and pointing them to new directions in which they could enrich themselves. But first, we have to question the claim of completeness or perfection or the ultimate in terms of analytical framework that those theories are often made to play, which despite their inadequacies. If we do that enough, then we can actually produce knowledge in conversation, but critical conversations in a way that fits very neatly into one of Chinua Achebe's proverbs I like using, where he says, the world is like a dancing masquerade. If you want to do justice to it, you cannot afford to stand on one spot. The world of the insights we bring to the world keeps evolving. And if you want to be a theory that can attract attention from scholars, regardless of geography, you have to be nimble-footed. And I think that would provide for a way forward for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much. Hlonipha, the last word?
I'm going to end with an ancestral voice. My grandmother did something very bizarre once. She explained how our ancestors used to smoke weed, how they used to smoke marijuana. I'm not going to tell you the context, too complicated story. So apparently our ancestors, the Zulus, used to smoke hemp in a pipe that had water at the bottom, and they would smoke and then start to spit on the ground. This is how my grandmother, they used to make their spittle drool on the ground. So she explained it to me, and for some strange reason, I kept it in my head. And then the other day, I was paging through the isiZulu dictionary, the Doke and Vilakazi dictionary, which is actually published by Wits Press. And there was a word describing exactly what my grandmother had told me. And it's called, I think, something like isigere. But what these Zulu young men were doing, they were breaking a labyrinth. So essentially, they were trying to work. So the Basotho, their enemies, were using labyrinths to protect themselves. So they were building these labyrinths. And these young men were spitting on the ground because they were trying to break the code. They were essentially trying to find a way. So they were using their spit to find their way on how to break into this labyrinthine stone structures that the Basothos had built to protect themselves. So in some ways, what we're trying to do when we have these conversations is do exactly that, to break the labyrinth and try and find our way into this kind of these fortresses that have been built around knowledge. And as I say, when my grandmother described it when I was a child, it was like, okay, that's useful information. I don't know if I'll be smoking a hemp pipe anytime soon. But when I saw the description in the dictionary that these young men were actually trying to break into this labyrinth that their enemy had built, it gave it a totally different meaning. So I'm going to be, when we talk about theorizing, I'm now going to be using this Zulu word for breaking the labyrinth, as it were, or breaking into the labyrinth.
Please join me in thanking our speakers very, very much.
All right. I can only agree. This was a very, very good conversation. My name is Bjørn Enge Bertelsen, to keep it in my vernacular, which is Norwegian. I'm the academic director of the Holberg Prize, and this has been truly 3 amazing days. Hlonipha now suggested that conversations like this is trying to decode labyrinths, but I will offer 3 more ways in which to think about these conversations. I mean, one was the one I suggested on the first day, much inspired by Holberg Laureate 2022 Professor Sheila Jasanoff's suggestion of the relation between technology and empire. And one can extend technology to also encompass, I guess, science, research, and the kinds of issues that you have been discussing critically here today. And one could think of these 4 days as an experiment in undoing those type of connections between technology and empire. So that's one way in which I have thought about these conversations. And the second one is that one can think of these as events, and events in a fundamental sense. And I think Achille alluded to the power of the event the other day in one of his interventions. And as we know, the secret to an event is that it has multiple temporalities within it. It has the linear one, which is from clock X to clock Y, and the second one is the part of the event that endures, that lives on, that changes you, that makes you think. So in a sense, an event is something that is never over, and I think the 4 conversations here will endure, and they have shaped at least me in fundamental ways. The third way to think about events is to think of them, or these conversations, is to think of them as gifts, in a sense. And gifts demand, of course, sharing, giving, listening, but also forms of endurance and reciprocity. And I think we've seen all of those things during these 3 days. So I think we've all been gifted, we've all been changed by the events, and we have all, perhaps unwittingly, become part of a technology of undoing problematic relations between empire and science, research, and hegemonic thinking. And it has been a great pleasure to be able to curate and think about and to suggest these kinds of conversations with WISER, with the Innovation Foundation for Democracy, and I would like to thank especially Sarah Nuttall and Achille Mbembe for that. I would also like to thank all those who have been running behind the scenes here, who have not been here on stage, who have not been visible, and who will not be visible either on the streams that will be available to people. So thank you, everyone, from the technicians to Najiba and Ellen and to everyone else. So this has been a great 3 days. It has been great to try to bring the relevance of the Holberg Prize and the research we celebrate at the Holberg Prize beyond North America and beyond Northern Europe, and I think we've all learned a lot. So we should all feel elated, actually, and happy, and it's a Friday afternoon. So let's give everyone a big round of applause, and thank you.